Now, for a closer look at the cultural dimension of this presidential election result, Olivia Salazar-Winspear joins me now from our Culture Desk. Hello, Olivia. Tell us a little bit more about Macron's cultural policy.
Well, Annette, if we look back at the last 5 years, we can say that he's allocated more funds to the Culture Ministry. Their budget has gone up by 15% since 2017. That stands at over €4 billion a year now, although it is worth mentioning that the Justice, Ecology and Interior Ministries also got percentage increases and more than culture. One major project that Macron had that he campaigned on in 2017 was giving more young people better access to culture by the creation of the Culture Pass. This is initially a cheque of €500 that 18-year-olds would receive to spend on cultural events or lessons or items. That's evolved since then. It's distributed differently now in 2 chunks of money, and when teenagers are a bit younger, it's been very popular. 1.6 million teenagers are currently using it with things like concerts, bookshops, museums, cinemas, and even shops selling musical instruments involved. And for his second term, he wants to extend that programme, reaching up to 4 million young people, including even younger age groups, even younger teenagers. Some have criticised it for being a bit of a commercial gimmick, just allowing teenagers to buy the sort of things like manga comics or cinema tickets that they would be buying anyway, but it is getting them into cultural spaces. Macron had also wanted to make public libraries more accessible by extending their hours. That has and hasn't worked out. And in that battle of high versus low culture, this administration has really recognised the dominance and the power of the streaming platforms. And France last year actually adopted a European directive into French law that obliges the Amazons, Netflix, Disney Plus, all of them, to reinvest 20% of their profits into French and European audiovisual production, and that could generate as much as €250 million here. And let's look at the positive side. One policy point that got a lot of applause here in France and abroad was the restitution of African artworks that had been looted during the colonial period to Benin. 26 pieces of art went from the Quai Branly Museum back to Benin, and that initiative came directly from the Macron administration. But overall, during this election, there were many in the cultural sector who said that, culture wasn't high up enough on the agenda, and it was virtually absent, in fact.
And of course, then we've had COVID-19, and the pandemic's been an extraordinarily fraught time for the cultural world across the globe, effectively, because suddenly they were deemed to be non-essential. So what's the view on how that was handled by Macron's administration?
Well, I'd say here in France, people perhaps felt a little less non-essential than elsewhere because Macron decided to inject some €15 billion into the sector in March 2020. He said everything will be done to protect the sector, whatever the costs. And prominent union leaders from those cultural industries have said they were relieved to be French at a time that when their European colleagues weren't being supported by similar systems. And this applies particularly to the intermittents du spectacle, the arts professionals. Here you can see some of the figures there. The intermittents du spectacle, the people who work from contract to contract, got €1.3 billion in funding. There were funds for film and music industries separately, furlough schemes for employees in the cultural sector, and state-secured loans for businesses who needed to stay afloat during that time when live performances were cancelled. There was also a stimulus package, which was seen to be quite generous and sustainable overall because it does avoid mass unemployment. And from an audience point of view, I don't know if you remember, Annette, but French audiences and culture lovers were allowed to go back to those culture spaces a bit earlier than in other countries, thanks to the health pass and the fact that there was a mask mandate, which meant that everyone felt a bit more safe.
It's certainly got a view from here that the French were very sort of specific in making sure that the sector was kept alive at all costs. In the US, however, for example, we often see artists showing their support for candidates, and it can be a boost for their campaigns. Was that the case here in France in the run-up to the vote?
It's not something that's so prevalent in French campaigning or on both sides of the political divide, but there was quite a bit of mobilisation in the arts sector against Marine Le Pen in the middle of the 2 voting rounds. For example, almost 500 artists signed the open letter you can see there calling on voters to vote against the far right. Musicians like Charlotte Gainsbourg, Mathieu Chédid, who's known as M, Bruno Solo, as well as actors, filmmakers, and writers. And the larger point that they were making was that Marine Le Pen and her party represent a threat to democracy, and that is not an ideology in which a diverse and well-funded arts sector can flourish. So now the decision has been made, of course, that's not going to be the case. Looking ahead, what can we expect? Probably more of the same from the Macron administration, that is protection for the sector and the cultural industries, and a bigger push for contemporary creation. Emmanuel Macron has said that he'll be making new art commissions, that's the idea being to boost creativity among young artists. And there has even been talk of creating a European metaverse, that is virtual reality experiences that could take place in French museums or heritage sites. And that would, of course, serve as competition for the big American and Asian platforms who are currently doing that.
Thank you. That's Olivia Salazar-Winspear taking a look at the cultural sector's response to the election result.